All right, let's talk a little bit about the GitHub workflow, which is one of my favorite things to talk about of all time. To start off, let's do a little demo work. There's a really great website here on guides.github.com, and it kind of walks you through the GitHub flow and the main steps that are involved.
Yeah, this is really nice. I feel like it's evolved a little bit. I saw it some time ago. It was a little bit simpler, and now it's been added too, so it includes like the conversation and stuff. It's really cool.
Right, glad. Well, I'm glad you like it. Yeah, on this site, it walks you through the whole flow, and it also has a little bit of explanation on each step. So if you're familiar with Git flow, it has a few more steps and really works with more branches, a little bit more of a complex structure. GitHub flow is really the same basic concept, but scaled down a little bit for just one feature branch or one project branch.
Okay.
So branching, this is important. Branching is different in Git than in other version control systems. Same word, but very different meaning. You start off by creating a branch. You can do this on github.com, you can do it on the command line, you can do it in any text editor or GUI that has a plugin. It's important because you don't want to make your changes on this master branch. In this diagram here, this thick light blue line represents master branch, and that's the blessed version of code. That's what's in production. If you're going to be testing stuff, making little changes, you don't really want that to be deployed before you're really finished.
Yeah.
So you make a feature branch, and that's this darker blue line here. Once you have that feature branch, these little circles represent commits. Commits are, each commit is a snapshot of the repository at the time that you make that commit. So after you branch, you could make some changes on this version of code. And remember, a branch is really just a pointer, so it looks exactly like the master version. So you make changes to that, save your commits, and you want to commit to be just an atomic amount of change.
Okay.
It doesn't have to be a big amount of change, but something that you can package up nicely in a couple sentences, and if you want to go back and change it, you'll know exactly where it is.
So that's easier whenever a project is more mature and you're going to go back into it, and you really are just going to resolve one bug or add one feature, and the commit is going to have everything to do with that one bug or that one feature. I find that earlier on in a project, you know, all the ideas are flowing and I'm writing a whole bunch of code, and it's more of a discipline for me to say, okay, it works the way it is, like I just did my initial, you know, generated my template. Now I'm going to do one thing and one thing only, and then I'm going to commit that. And I'm going to make sure that like my site still loads or my application still runs or whatever, and then I'm going to do another thing and I'm going to commit that. That's what you mean by atomic commits, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Just small units of change. You'd like for the commits, the commit log, to just tell a story of your project throughout its development.
Yeah. It's actually, for me, it's still kind of a bit of a discipline to remember doing that initial branch. You know, I mean, it used to be with central source control that it was, you know, I associate creating a branch with like creating a directory and copying code and all that stuff. And with Git, I say create a branch, and it's like, all right, I'm done. You've got your new branch.
Yeah, it's much simpler in Git.
Yeah.
So it's definitely a mental shift to be used to that, but we definitely encourage it in terms of best practices for the GitHub flow.
Yeah.
So we've made some changes, we've made some commits, and we're working on a project together. So it's time that we introduce those changes and start to ask for some feedback.
Okay.
We always say you should have pull requests early on in the process.
All right.
So you open up a pull request. A pull request really is just a conversation around code. When you have a pull request, there will be code included in that. Any code differences that exist on this branch, you're comparing that branch with the master branch, but you can also shift that to compare different branches. Then you'd hope to have a conversation. So when I opened this pull request, I might @mention Code Foster and say, hey, what do you think of these changes? What do you think our next step should be? And that's when we move on to making some more commits and having a discussion. Like we've talked about, GitHub is about collaboration. It's not just me making a project by myself. I really want your input. And at that point, you might say, we're sort of on the right track. What about this? We would make some more changes and then save those in the form of commits.
Okay. So those follow-on commits, are those part of the same pull request or a new one?
They're part of the same pull request.
Oh, okay.
So even if you, so say we opened our pull request back here, we make more commits, that pull request will update and show new commits that have been made to that branch and continue to show the difference between that branch and whatever branch you're comparing.
Excellent. And then there's a squirrel.
And there's a squirrel. This is our deploy step. Now this one, is not as much of a core step in the GitHub flow. We're not going to show it today, for example.
Yeah.
But this is where you might use an integration, something like continuous integration and deployment.
Yeah.
And you can actually deploy from branches.
Yeah.
So if you want to know if your code is going to work, you might want to try that out before it's in your master branch.
Right,
and
right.
GitHub allows for that in really few, like, easy click of a button kind of way.
Now, let me just give the context here for folks that are in the Windows environment and working.
Sure.
You're probably working on Azure, and at this point, you can tell Azure, I really want to deploy this code automatically and continuously, and you get to tell it which branch you want. You can choose another branch, or you can say master branch is the gospel, and so that's the one where the changes are always going to come from. And so then the squirrel step isn't necessary, because once you merge back into master, those are pulled into Azure. Alternatively, you can push your changes into Azure, still using Git, by telling Azure to kind of host its own little repo. Give yourself a new remote. We'll talk about all those terms later. And then at that step, at the deploy step, that's when you would push to your Azure remote, and then that would deploy it.
Exactly right. You hit the nail on the head. Once you've decided that everything's going to be fine, it's going to deploy well, you haven't broken anything too major, that's when you merge the pull request back into the master branch. And that's going to put all of these commits that you made on that feature branch and move them up so that they now exist on master.
Okay.
And at that point, depending on if there's other branches that maybe have been merged in, you might see some merge conflicts, or you might see that there's absolutely nothing wrong and you can merge in with no problems at all.
Mm-hmm.
And Git is smart. Git goes line by line. So even if we made changes in a file on this branch, somebody else made changes in that same file that have been merged in, as long as they're not the same lines, Git is going to know that. And Git will not put any merge conflict markers as long as it's different lines of code.
Okay. Now, if there are merge conflicts, I have to resolve that.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, Git's not going to want you to erase somebody else's work without you looking at it.
Yeah.
And that's when you need to bring it down locally and maybe get into the command line, which we'll talk about a bit later.
Okay. Now, in my experience, I've worked quite a bit with pull requests where there's a fork of a repository, and the pull request is between one fork and another, one repo and an entirely another one. But what you're showing here is that within the context of the same repo, I can use the pull request workflow to kind of fulfill this ideal workflow and to be used as a collaboration tool.
Yes, yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up. So a lot of projects use this fork and pull model where there's a remote on github.com. You would fork that project because you don't have access to just make changes directly to that repository. And then you make changes locally and you want to introduce those changes back into the original repository. That still is a pull request.
Yeah.
But like you said, we really suggest the collaborator model to still use pull requests.
Okay.
So even if you have access to just go ahead and commit to master and not ask anybody if they like your changes, we really suggest making a branch describing your feature and then still having a conversation about it before you introduce that code into master branch.
Otherwise, the conversation is, hey, I just pushed a bunch of code up there. I hope you like it.
Exactly, right. And you're missing out on what could be a lot of great contributions.
Yeah, yeah. Great. All right, well, that feels to me like we've covered the concept of the flow. I think it's really important, and I'm glad that there's a document online, kind of a living document and a nice animation, so I can always go back to it and remind myself, start with that branch, make sure you have atomic commits, and then have conversations. You're writing this code with other people.
Exactly right.
Cool.